Hello guys. I'm gonna do a quick video. It's thundering out, which I adore, so I'm gonna stand out here and share the stage with a very loud grumbling. So I'm gonna do a video on what I've just titled The Myth of Spiritual Restraint. And what I mean by spiritual restraint is the proliferating idea that there's anything spiritual about holding yourself back. And this idea has been with us for as long as mysticism and the idea of spirituality, the practice of spirituality, whatever the fuck that word means, has been with us. So ever since the first teachers were around, there's always been an image of the saint as someone who has overcome their animal drives. And I'm not sure if it's entirely appropriate to just say animal drives for an animal. It's kind of unnecessary. But so you have the image of this sadhu up in a mountain, alone, valiantly overcoming his terrible human desires. And this is spiritual. And this would be the most, I just got a tornado warning. I'm not worried about it. So this would be the most exaggerated version of the idea of spiritual restraint. The usual way it plays out for us is much more subtle and much more common. So first of all, I'll start by saying this image of the saint transcending the animal drives is an extension of the way our egos or minds normally function. Because what the ego does is constantly doubt, judge, edit, tamper with our initial impulses. So I go to speak with my friend, and instead of just saying whatever it is that comes to me to say, I'm constantly wondering, or the ego is constantly wondering, because you have to understand this ego, this mind, has a life of its own, and it's not you. And so I'm wondering, or the ego's wondering, should I say this? Should I do this? Or shouldn't I? And this already is a form of restraint. And so if you follow that attitude of constantly selecting which impulses to act out on to its end, you'll end up with the image of the holy saint who's overcome being a monkey, or a human monkey anyways. And this is a complete bullshit image, right? Completely bullshit. And it resonates with us for the reason that we want to believe that the end goal of our spirituality will involve the ego, but it doesn't. And that's part of the humor of it all, is that the one who sets out on the journey is not the one who comes out. The ego is, after all of this process plays out, just drops off, right? So it's a false image, just as the ego is a false image of ourselves. And I'm going to talk briefly, in my version briefly, about all that's necessary in the moment that you decide to restrain yourself for you to do. And what I mean by that is when you are questioning whether what you're doing is right or wrong, directing what you're doing from within the ego, from within the mind, you, in that moment, even by assuming that you should direct your own actions in a certain way, do a multitude of different delusional things. And I'll break this down for you. Say I'm talking with my friend, and he has a certain idea about himself that he's very easygoing, and he's criticizing someone else for being too uptight, but is very uptight. And this is just an off-the-fly example. It's not very colorful, but whatever. And I say, hey man, you're actually being pretty uptight right now by spending all your energy invested in picking apart this other uptight individual, right? I could say that, or if my ego's operative, I'll wonder whether I should say that. And this is where restraint comes in. Do we say something which makes someone else uncomfortable? Or do we judge for ourselves whether that's right or wrong? And I want to break this down. So step one, when you go to restrain yourself, you immediately have to assume that you know what's best for the person that's involved in your actions, and you also have to assume that you know what's best for yourself. And the problem with this is that all of our assumptions are born out of past material, out of accumulated information. And so we cannot assume what's best for us because we don't see the full picture, right? When we're looking to the immediate to try to determine what's best for us, we're really only looking to what makes us comfortable or uncomfortable, or feel pain or pleasure, right? So if I'm to tell myself, no, don't mention that your friend is uptight, protect him from that inside information, right? Then all I'm doing really is protecting my friend from discomfort, but that's not necessarily the best thing for his development, right? So if I make myself the judge and jury of what I should and shouldn't say, I'm actually not allowing myself to be a functioning part of reality. Because it's actually the imposed order on what we should and shouldn't do that's the problem. It's not our actions themselves. There's nothing wrong with us. We've just been convinced by the system of opposing order to our natural drives that there's something wrong with us. I think it's kind of funny that a baby, right, goes through all the effort of growing all its cells, growing its beautiful body, going through the birth canal, doing that really strenuous exercise and coming into the world, and then as soon as it gets out of the womb, there's a bunch of neurotic adults waiting, going, oh, there's a lot more left to do, you're still not perfect yet, keep going, keep going. And if you've noticed that babies are often a lot more content than adults, I would say maybe the adult should just not say anything at all and let it keep doing its thing. It got that far, right? My point here is that there's nothing wrong with us. The impression that there's something wrong with us is the problem. And it came in early in our lives, right? So I'm going to go back to my initial framework and say, as soon as you assume that you should decide what you should and shouldn't do, then you have actually covertly assumed that there's something wrong with you. Because if there's nothing wrong with you, then everything you do would be perfect, right? It would be natural expression of what you are. And this argument isn't boding well for those saints, huh? The actually, the spiritual quote-unquote person, the whole person, is someone who embraces that and gets out of the judging mind. So in the moment you decide whether or not to do what you're going to do, you have to first take a godlike position in which you assume that you can see the whole picture and that you shouldn't cause someone discomfort even if that will help them grow. And that's a cowardly decision. And you also have to assume that there's something wrong with you, or else you wouldn't have to second guess yourself. You wouldn't have to second guess your initial impulse to say or do something. So this is not boding well for the idea of spiritual restraint, right? And this is often a perversion of the idea of nonviolence, is that a sort of constipated ambivalence where nobody actually does anything because they're so worried about stepping on each other's toes. The whole way this world is built is creatures stepping on each other's toes. It's part of the natural order. Our attempt to erase disorder from the natural order is the most disorderly thing that's ever been done, and that's why the whole cultural institution of laws, abstract principles, and ordering is evil in my book, because you're pitting human animals against their own instincts and causing them to be split with themselves. And another point I want to make about why the idea of the restrained, repressed individual has been associated with saintly characteristics is that it bodes well for us as mental identities to believe that we are trying to rise above the physical. We're not trying to rise above the physical, we're trying to incarnate into the physical, be fully alive, be fully here, shine our own individual animal glow. My zebra glow, your whatever glow. And so if this idea of worshiping something and thinking ourselves sinful for having drives, it bodes well for the invisible mind which is capturing us, the ego mind, because it actually makes the path about that mind, that the path is actually about ridding ourselves of. So if I am to restrain myself, we've established that 1, I must assume as an egoic mind, because that's the only instrument I have to restrain myself with, or consider restraining myself with, which is a form of restraint, I must assume that I know with that very confused mind that what's best for me, right? And what's best for those around me, instead of trusting the deeper order of things to work itself out. And I found very clearly that if I express myself, it may lead to conflict, but it will always lead to a more harmonious outcome, right? If I speak the truth, it may lead to conflict, but it will always lead to a more harmonious outcome. So that's part of this myth, that there's anything spiritual about holding yourself back. If you hold yourself back, you're not being a natural animal. You're not letting nature live out its whole spectrum through you. And I'm gonna sojourn inside because it's getting quite rainy to finish off this little guy. And 2, if I'm gonna restrain myself, I have to assume that there's something wrong with me on some level already. And I've already thrown those 2 things out. What else do I have to assume? I have to assume a certain relationship between the mind and the body, where the mind is the ruler of the body, and the body is ruled by the mind. If you're restraining yourself, there has to be a restrainer and restrained. So it involves a duality with yourself, a split with yourself. And as I said, the saintly image of the man overcoming the animal drives is only an extension of the repressed ego controlling the body, right? It's not about controlling the body. It's about becoming the body, integrating the mind into that form, being the wholest you can be while you're alive. So I also have to assume when I go to restrain myself, when I go to tell my friend that he's really talking about himself and not someone he knows, I have to assume that the mind should be controlling the body, and that the body, through our assumption that there's something wrong, doesn't know well enough on its own. This is a complete reversal of the true state of things. The intelligence in the body is